I will pay you $3 million if you read this document. Amara didn't flinch, but her small hand into a fist against her denim jacket. She didn't look at the money, she looked at the man. She had never seen a smile that felt so much like a threat, sharp, loud, and flashing with gold. Kang Min-jae leaned back in his leather chair, his neck tattoos as he laughed, a sound that filled the high-security office with a terrifying confidence. He spoke as if the world were a game he had already won. Behind Amara, Grace's hand was a steady, warm weight on her shoulder, a silent shield against the room full of suited men with folded arms. Amara took a slow, deep breath, tasting the expensive cologne and cold air of the office. She knew that in rooms like this, adults expected to be noise or a nuisance. She stepped forward anyway. "My name is Amara Collins," she said. Her voice was thin like a wire, but just as strong. "I am 7 years old." Min-jae grin widened, though his eyes remained cold. He had expected trembling, he had expected a plea. He hadn't expected a girl who looked at him as if he were the one being tested. "Very brave, Amara," he purred, sliding the heavy, leather-bound ledger across the mahogany desk. Amara didn't look at the gods. She didn't ask about the $3 million again. "If I read this," she said, her eyes locking onto his, "the debt for my grandmother is, can you give us your word?" Min-jae chuckled a dry, amused sound. "Yes, that is the deal." Amara nodded. She reached out and touched the first page. The paper was thick, smelling of old ink and secrets. To the men in the room, these markings were a dead code. To Amara, they were a map. She didn't need to translate. She just needed to listen to what the ink was saying. She looked up once, that the boss was watching. Then she looked down and began. The first page was classical Korean, written in a script meant to hide the truth from modern eyes. Yeogiseo Sichakdunion Jian. Her pronunciation flawless and hauntingly mature. The room went deathly silent. Kang Min-jae's grin didn't just fade, it froze. The silence that followed Amara's first words was not the polite silence of a room waiting for a child to finish a recital. It was a sudden, vacuum-like pressure, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the office by the sheer impossibility of what they were hearing. Kang Min-jae remained frozen, his hand still resting near the gold-nibbed pen on his desk. The wide, mocking grin he had worn moments ago was now a grotesque mask, caught halfway between a laugh and a snarl. Behind him, the semicircle of enforcers men, who had spent their lives perfecting the art of the intimidating stare, shifted. One man's arms uncrossed, his hand dropping instinctively toward his belt, not out of aggression, but out of a sudden, primal confusion. Amara did not look up. She kept her small, dark fingers pressed against the ivory-colored vellum of the ledger. The paper felt cool, but the words felt, pulsing with a history that didn't belong in a modern skyscraper. She traced the calligraphy of the classical Korean script, her eyes moving with a rhythmic grace that suggested she wasn't just reading the characters, but hearing the voices of the people who had written them centuries ago. "The foundations of the house are built on the silence of the Han," Amara continued, her voice gaining a melodic depth that seemed to vibrate against the glass walls of the office. Her pronunciation of the archaic honorifics was flawless accents that had died out in the streets of Seoul before her grandmother was even born. "But the debt of the blood is never truly washed away by the tide." She paused, her small chest rising and falling in a steady cadence. She could feel the heat of Min-jae's gaze on the top of her head. It was no longer the gaze of a predator looking at a lamb. It was the man who had just realized the lamb was speaking in his father's tongue. One of the younger gods, a man with a jagged scar running through his eyebrow, let out a nervous, sharp breath. He whispered, his voice cracking the chin. "She's memorized it." The old woman fed it to her. Min-jae didn't move his head, but his eyes flickered toward the guard. The look was so lethal the younger man immediately lowered his head, his face flushing a deep, shamed crimson. Min-jae knew it wasn't a trick. He had kept this ledger in a biometric safe that only 3 people in the world could open. The text inside was written in a dialect used by the secret societies of the Joseon, era code meant to ensure that even if the book were stolen, it would look like nothing more than ancient poetry to the uninitiated. "Turn the page," Min-jae commanded. His voice was no longer boisterous. It was low, raspy, and stripped of all its theatrical bravado. Amara looked up at him. Her wide, serious hold a trace of triumph. Instead, they held a profound, quiet sadness, the kind of look one gives a person who is about to receive bad news. She glanced back at her grandmother. Grace Collins didn't say a word, but the grip on Amara's tightened for a fraction of a second, a signal of protection, a reminder that they were in this together. Amara turned the heavy page. The sound of the paper sliding against the mahogany was like a gunshot in the quiet room. On this page, the script changed. The elegant, sweeping curves of the Korean characters were replaced by the sharp, architectural precision of Hanja Chinese characters used in a specific, localized context. The third moon sees the harvest of the three-headed dragon. Amara read, her tongue navigating the complex glottal stops of the dialect with the ease of a native speaker. She didn't stumble. She didn't hesitate. The gold flows not to the palace, but to the shadow under the bridge. 7 weights are promised, but only 4 are delivered to the master of the house. The air in the room changed instantly. The enforcers, who had been staying like statues, were now looking at one another with narrowed eyes. Amara had just read an entry that detailed a betrayal from within the organization. She was reading the evidence of a lie that had been buried in code for years. Min Jae's knuckles turned white. The tattoos on his neck seemed to tighten as he leaned forward, his chest nearly touching the edge of the desk. He was no longer the king of the mountain. He was a man realizing that his mountain was hollow. Read that last part again, Min Jae hissed. Amara looked at the line. She knew the danger was rising. She could feel the electricity in the room, the way the men in the background were now tensing their muscles, ready for the violence that usually followed a revelation of treason. Only 4 weights are delivered, Amara repeated softly, her voice steady despite the storm brewing around her. The master of the house eats the crumbs of his own table while the servant grows fat. Min Jae let out a long, slow hiss of air through his teeth. He looked at the ledger, then at the small girl in the denim jacket. For the first time in his life, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced since he was a street urchin in Busan. He felt small. He had brought this girl here to mock her. He had offered the 3 million as a joke, a way to show his men that even the genius of the West was nothing compared to the power of his money. But as Amara stood there, her neat high-puff hairstyle catching the light of the setting sun through the window, she looked like an ancient judge. She wasn't just reading a document, she was stripping him bare. Enough, Min Jae said, though his lacked its usual bite. He looked at Grace, who stood as tall and unyielding as a mountain behind the child. Where did she learn this? No one teaches this. This dialect hasn't been spoken in a century. Grace didn't blink. The world is much older than your money, she said, her voice a calm, resonant counterpoint to the tension. And my granddaughter has always known how to listen to things that others have forgotten to hear. Amara closed the ledger. The thud of the cover echoed. She looked at Min Jae, her still guarded, but no longer afraid. She had crossed the first bridge. She had shown him that his secrets weren't safe behind his tattoos and his guards. I've read the first section, Amara said, her voice regaining that small, steady quality. Does the deal still stand? Min Jae looked at the ledger, then at the $3 million check sitting on the corner of the desk. A piece of paper that now felt like a very small price for the secrets this child held in her head. He didn't answer immediately. He looked at his men, then back at the girl who had just his world upside down with a single sentence. The lost gone. The game was over. Now the real story began. The heavy silence that followed the revelation of the Korean betrayal hung in the air like wood smoke. Kang Min Jae's eyes remained fixed on the ledger, his gaze tracing the characters Amara had just read as if trying to physically erase the words with his sight. He was a man who prided himself on knowing every secret in his city, yet a 7-year-old girl in a denim jacket had taken a knife from his own pocket and shown him the blade. He didn't look at his men. He didn't need to. He could feel the shift in their loyalty, the sudden, sharp suspicion that now pulsed through the room. If the ledger contained one betrayal, it likely contained dozens. Turn the page, Min Jae said again. This time, his voice a thin, dangerous whisper. He wasn't playing a game anymore. He was a man drowning, reaching for a branch. Amara looked at Grace, whose hand remained a warm, unwavering anchor on her shoulder. Receiving a small, almost imperceptible nod from her grandmother, Amara turned the vellum. The texture changed under her fingertips, becoming smoother, more modern, but the ink was darker, more aggressive. The characters on this page were no longer the flowing curves of Korean script. They were the dense, intricate grids of Mandarin, interspersed with the sharp, rhythmic strokes of Japanese kanji. To the enforcers standing in the shadows, it looked like a mess of foreign business logs. To Amara, it was a conversation across an ocean. "This is not just one voice," Amara said, her voice small but filling every corner of the sterile office. "It is a bridge between shores." She began to read, and as she did, the very air in the room seemed to grow colder. She shifted into Mandarin with a tonal precision that made the bilingual guards in the back of the rooms and then their backs in shock. She spoke of the Northern Wharf and the Jadant, detailing shipments that had never appeared on any official manifest. "The cargo is marked as silk and tea," Amara read, her eyes tracking a series of hidden annotations in the margins. "But the weight is recorded in grams, not bolts." On the 14th night of the rain, the transaction was completed not in the office, but on a vessel named the Silver Crane. Min Jae's face went from a frozen mask to a pale, ghostly white. The Silver Crane was a ghost ship, a vessel that technically didn't exist in any maritime registry he controlled. It was his private channel for the most sensitive assets of the Mafia, assets even his inner circle wasn't supposed to know about. Amara didn't stop. Without a second's hesitation, she glided into Japanese as she reached the bottom of the page. Her voice took on a sharper, more clear rhythm, matching the linguistic demands of the text. She began to detail a series of transactions with a Tokyo-based conglomerate, a partnership that Min Jae had publicly denied for years to avoid a war with rival factions. "The tribute is paid in the shadow of the Shinjuku gates," Amara translated, her voice steady and clinical. 12% is diverted to an account under the name The Sleeping Monk. The signature is not yours, Mr. Kang. It is the signature of the man who holds your seal. At those words, a chair scraped harshly against the floor. One of the high-ranking associates, a man in a gray suit who had been the most vocal in his laughter earlier, took a half-step back. His face was a map of sudden, frantic terror. Amara looked up, her wide, serious eyes landing directly on the man in the gray suit. She didn't know his name, and she didn't know his crimes, but she could see the truth written on him as clearly as it was written on the page. "He says here," Amara added, her voice drawn to a whisper that felt louder than a shout, "that the master is getting old and his eyes are clouded. He says the $3 million you offered today was already missing from the vault months ago." The explosion of movement was instantaneous. 3 enforcers moved at once, not toward Amara, but toward the man in the gray suit. Before he could reach the door, he was pinned against the glass wall of the office, the sound of the impact echoing like a thunderclap. In the center of the chaos, Amara and Grace stood perfectly still. They were a small island of calm in a sea of rising violence. Amara did not flinch at the shouting or the sound of the struggle. She simply kept hand on the book, her task unfinished. Kang Min-jae slowly stood up. He didn't look at the traitor being dragged out of the room. He didn't look at the guards. He walked around the edge of his massive desk until he was standing only a few feet away from the little girl. He was a giant compared to her, a mound of muscle and ink. But for the first time, he looked at her with something that wasn't condescension or amusement. It was fear. He was looking at a child who could see through the walls he had built around his life. He was looking at a mind that treated his most dangerous secrets as if they were simple bedtime stories. "You're not just reading," Min Jae said, his voice trembling slightly. "You're seeing the lines between the words." "The words are the truth, Mr. Kang," Amara replied. Her voice soft but lessons Grace had taught her in their small kitchen at home. "The ink doesn't know how to lie. Only people do." Min Jae looked down at the ledger. He realized then that he hadn't invited a performer into his office. He had invited a mirror. And in that mirror, he was seeing the rot of his own empire. The $3 million he had promised, the money he had intended to never pay now, felt like a weight around his neck. He looked at Grace, who met his gaze with a look of ironclad dignity. She didn't have a gun, and she didn't have a gang, but she had the girl. And the girl had the truth. There is more. Her hand moving toward the next page. There is a third shore. It is written in a script that has no country. Min-jae reached out, hand hovering over the book. He wanted to close it. He wanted to stop the bleeding of his secrets. But he couldn't. He was possessed by a desperate, terrifying need to know what else this child could see. Read, he commanded, though it sounded more like a plea. Read it all. Amara looked down at the next page where the ghost code awaited. The real test was just beginning. Amara turned the page, and the room seemed to contract. The paper here was different, older, darker, and textured with the grain of a time before digital ledgers and offshore accounts. The script that sprawled across the yellowed surface was not the Hangul of the modern era, or the rigid kanji of the previous pages. It was a fluid, haunting series of symbols that looked more like falling rain or tangled silk. For a moment, Amara remained motionless. Her wide eyes scanned the ink, her small chest rising and falling in a rhythmic, silent cadence. Behind her, Grace Collins felt the temperature in the room drop as the enforcers leaned forward, their heavy breathing the only sound against the hum of the city outside. Kang Min-jae's hand, which had been tapping rhythmically on the mahogany, stopped. He leaned in, his muscular frame casting a long shadow over the desk. The neck tattoos that had seemed like symbols of his invincibility now looked like jagged scars in the dim light. He recognized the script, but he could not read it. It was the ghost code, an archaic, oral-derived dialect used by the founding fathers of the Five Dragons, a script meant to be understood only by the bloodline of the masters. "It's empty," one of the younger guards whispered, his voice trembling. "It's just art. No one can speak that anymore." Amara didn't look up. She touched a specific character, a swirling loop of ink that sat at the top of a column. "It isn't art." Her voice drew into a low, resonant register that vibrated with an authority far beyond her 7 years. "It is a memory. But it's a memory that has been twisted." She began to read. The sounds that left her mouth were unlike anything heard in that office before. They were guttural yet melodic, filled with the glottal stops and long, whistling vowels of a dialect that had been considered extinct for nearly a century. As the words flowed, the atmosphere shifted from corporate intimidation to something ancient and heavy. "The river does not flow backward," Amara read, her small finger tracing the path of the ink. "But the blood of the father is betrayed by the son. The first master built the walls with stone and honor, but the new master builds them with glass and lies." Min-jae's jaw tightened. He felt a cold sweat prickle beneath his sleek black suit. This wasn't just a record of transactions anymore. It was a testament, a direct message from his ancestors that seemed to be speaking directly to his soul through the voice of a child he had intended to humiliate. "The secret of the seventh gate is not gold," Amara continued, her pronunciation of the arcadorifics so precise that Min-jae felt as though his own grandfather were standing in the room, watching his every move. "The secret is the key held by the one who was cast out. On the night of the red moon, the seal was broken not by an enemy, but by the one who wears the gold ring of the dragon." The silence that followed was absolute. Min-jae looked down at his own hand, at the heavy dragon ring that signaled his absolute power. His confident grin didn't just fade. It vanished entirely, leaving behind a face that looked suddenly aged and vulnerable. He realized that the ledger was just a book of business. It was a warning, and Amara was the only one in the world who could hear it. He leaned in closer, his face only inches from the desk, his eyes searching the page as if he could somehow see what she saw. "What does it say about the inheritance?" he rasped, his stripped of all its former dominance. "What does it say about the lineage?" Amara looked up, her gaze meeting his with an intensity that made the Mafia boss pull back instinctively. There was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, ancient clarity. "It says that the throne is a debt, not a gift," she said softly, "and that the debt is now due." The enforcers in the semicircle looked at one another, the neutral expressions they had practiced for years beginning to crumble. They were witnesses to a transformation. The man at the desk, who had started the afternoon laughing and projecting total control, was now staring at a young girl in a denim jacket as if she held his life in her hands. Grace Collins felt the shift in the room's gravity. She knew the danger hadn't passed in many ways, it had tripled. But she also saw that the power had moved. It no longer sat with the man with the tattoos and the money. It sat with the words. Amara looked back down at the ghost code, the last line of the page waiting. She took a breath, then another, prepared to finish the sentence that would change everything. The bridge was fully built, and across it, the past was finally coming for the present. Amara took a shallow, measured breath, her eyes tracking a line of text that seemed to pulse darker than the rest. The ghost code was no longer just a collection of ancestral echoes. It had shifted into something far more clinical and modern, a bridge where the ancient script was being used to camouflage a very contemporary betrayal. The ink here was fresh, the brushstrokes hasty, as if the writer had been trembling with the weight of the secret they were burying. The dragon has 3 hearts, Amara began, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried to the furthest corners of the room. One for the family, one for the fire, and one that beats in a box of glass. Kang Min-jae leaned so far forward that the gold jewelry at his collar clinked against the edge of the mahogany desk. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. He recognized the metaphor of the 3 hearts. It was a foundational myth of his syndicate, but the box of glass was a term he had never heard. It was a new insertion into an old code. Amara's finger paused over a string of symbols that looked like broken chains. The box of glass is not in Seoul, she continued, her brow furrowed in concentration. It is a digital vault hidden behind a firewall named the Widow's Grief. Every time the moon is full, the fire heart bleeds. 5% of the tribute does not reach the mountain. It flows through a pipe in Singapore, then disappears into a sea of numbers. The effect on instantaneous and visceral. The man who had spent the afternoon projecting a terrifying, boisterous dominance suddenly went rigid. His confidence didn't just break, it transmuted into a cold, focused shock that was far more frightening. His skin took on a gray, waxy sheen, and the hand resting on the desk began to twitch, just once before he forced it into a fist. The $3 million, the exact figure he had been hunting for 6 months, convinced it was a bank error or a glitch in his software, was right there. It wasn't a glitch. Sophisticated siphon, hidden in the one place he never thought to look, the sacred, archaic ledger of his ancestors. The very book he treated as a relic was being used as a ledger for his own ruin. Read the account number, Min-jae commanded. His voice was no longer a roar. It was a jagged edge, a blade being drawn slowly from a sheath. Amara looked up at him. She saw the devastation in his eyes, the way his world was crumbling behind his pupils. She felt a surge of the loudness she usually feared, the chaotic energy of a powerful man losing his grip, but Grace's shoulder was a lightning rod, grounding the fear before it could paralyze her. "Isn't a number, Mr. Kang," Amara said softly. "It's a name. The script says the key to the glass box is held by the brother who shares the blood but hides the face." A low guttural sound escaped Min-jae's half-choke, half-growl. He knew exactly who that was. His younger brother, the one he had sent to handle the international accounts, the one he had trusted more than his own shadow. The silence in the boardroom was now so thick it felt physical. The enforcers, sensing the shift from a curiosity to a coup, backed away from the desk, their eyes darting between the boss and the exits. The power room had moved entirely. It no longer belonged to the man with the tattoos, the gold, or the guns. It belonged to the 7-year-old girl who had just dismantled a criminal empire by simply reading a page. Min-jae stared at Amara, his chest heaving. He looked at her as if she were a ghost, a divine messenger, or a demon. He had expected to laugh at her. He had expected to watch her fail and then send her home with a patronizing pat on the head. Instead, she had stripped him of his pride, his security, and his family's loyalty in less than an hour. He was frozen, trapped in the cold reality that the little girl in the denim jacket was the only person in his entire world who wasn't lying to him. The 3 million $3 seemed like a mockery now, a tiny, insignificant piece of paper compared to the truth she had unearthed. Amara didn't pull her hand away from the book. She stayed there, a small, steady light in the center of his gathering darkness. waiting for him to realize that the deal was no longer about the money. It was about survival. Kang Min-jae did not move. He sat in the opulent leather chair as if he had been turned to stone, his eyes fixed on the ledger that had suddenly become a mirror of his own betrayal. The office, usually a theater for his booming voice and calculated laughter, was now a tomb of silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the city's traffic 60 floors below and the steady, calm breathing of the child who had just dismantled his world. Amara did not pull her hand away from the page. She looked at the column of figures and symbols, her eyes moving with a maturity that seemed to age her delicate features. To the men in the room, these were just numbers and archaic script, a record of theft. But Amara saw the architecture of the lie. She saw the why and the how woven into the how much. The numbers aren't just amounts, Amara said, her voice cutting through the heavy air with a crystalline clarity. She tapped a series of small, rhythmic dots beneath the entry for the Singapore pipe. They are a schedule and a signature. Min-jae finally blinked. He leaned forward to almost touching the desk. The gold chains his neck swayed, but he didn't reach for them. "What do you mean, a signature?" he asked, his voice a jagged rasp. "Look at the spacing," Amara instructed, her small finger pointing to the gaps between the characters. "In the ghost code, the space between the ink is as important as the ink itself. My grandmother taught me that if you want to hide a message in plain sight, you don't use words. You use the rhythm of the counting." She began to trace a pattern, skipping over certain digits and highlighting others. "If you take every third number from the last 5 months, it doesn't add up to a currency value. It matches the coordinates of a shipping terminal in Incheon, the one you thought was closed for renovations." A sharp, collective intake of breath came from the semicircle of guards. The Incheon terminal was the backbone of their logistics, currently under the direct supervision of Min-jae's younger brother. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The theft wasn't just a siphon of cash, it was a parallel operation. A shadow syndicate was being built using Jay's own infrastructure. "And here," Amara continued, voice never wavering, "the thief wrote a note in the margins, hidden as a prayer for the ancestors. It says, 'The dragon is blind because he looks only at the sun.' It means you were so busy looking at the big deals and the loud enemies that you forgot to watch the shadows at your feet." Min-jae's face contorted. The loudness he had projected life, the tattoos, the jewelry, the booming laugh was exactly what had been used against him. He had been a distraction for himself. He looked at Amara, really looked at her, and for the first time he didn't see a child or a curiosity. He saw a strategic mind that operated on a frequency he couldn't even tune into. She wasn't just reading. She was deconstructing a masterwork of deception that had taken years to build. "How do you know this?" Min-jae whispered, his hands trembling slightly on the mahogany. "You are 7 years old. No school teaches the rhythm of the ghost code. No tutor knows the logistics of Incheon." Amara looked up, serious eyes meeting his. "I don't need a school to tell me when a pattern is broken, Mr. Kang. When I listen to a story, I listen for the parts that don't fit. My grandmother says the truth is like a heartbeat. If it skips a beat, something is wrong. Your ledger has been skipping beats for a long time." Grace Collins moved slightly, her hand shifting from Amara's shoulder to the small of her back, a gesture of immense pride. She didn't need to speak. The dignity of her silence was the perfect frame for Amara's brilliance. They had come here for a prize, but they were leaving with something far more potent, the absolute proof that the invisible people of the world often saw everything. Amara turned back to the ledger. "There is one last number, Mr. Kang. It's not in the code. It's written in pencil, very lightly, on the inside of the back cover. It's a date." Min-jae's eyes darted to the spot she indicated. He saw it then, almost invisible scrawl. The date was 3 days from now. "That is the date the box of glass in Singapore is set to be emptied," Amara said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you wait until then, the money, the brother, and the shadow syndicate will all disappear. The ink sedge is being burned as we speak." The frozen boss finally broke. He stood up abruptly, his chair clattering back against the glass wall. He didn't look at the 3 million check. He didn't look at his guards. He looked at the ledger as if it were a bomb about to detonate. The realization of Amara's genius had moved past shock and into a desperate, utilitarian respect. "She is more than a reader," Min-jae muttered, more to himself than anyone else. He looked at Grace, his expression one raw, unvarnished recognition. "You didn't bring me a child. You brought me a miracle." Amara closed the book. The soft thud was the final period on the billionaire's old life. She had revealed the truth in the ink, but in doing she had also revealed the truth of herself. She was no longer a girl sensing tension. She was the one controlling it. "The reading is finished," Amara said, her posture straightening. "The document is understood." Min-jae nodded slowly, the gold on his neck catching the last rays of the sun. He knew he owed her much more than $3 million. He owed her his empire. But as he looked into her calm, steady eyes, he realized that for a girl like Amara, the money was the least interesting thing in the room. What she wanted was what she had already taken: the right to be the most important person in the room without ever having to raise her voice. The revelation of the Incheon date hung in the air like a lit fuse. For a heartbeat, the room was still that the only sound was the ticking pendulum clock in the corner, marking the seconds of an empire's collapse. Kang Min-jae was staring at the pencil marks on the back cover, his face a battleground of grief and murderous intent. While the boss was frozen by the weight of the truth, the room around him began to fracture. One of the men in the background, a high-ranking enforcer named Choi with a heavy jaw and eyes like flint, suddenly moved. He didn't move the boss to offer support, nor did he move toward the traitor in the gray suit. His eyes were locked on the ledger. He knew that as long as that book was open, every man in the room was a target. Every secret was a ghost coming back to haunt them, and the little girl was the medium. With a sudden, violent lung, Choi stepped into the light. "This is a circus," he roared, his voice meant to shatter the hypnotic hold Amara had over the room. "The boss is being like a child's bedtime stories. This ends now." His hand shot out, thick and calloused, reaching for the ledger on the desk. He intended to snatch the document, to tear the pages, to erase the evidence before the boss could process the full depth of the betrayal. Amara didn't scream, but she flinched, her small hand instinctively covering the ancient vellum, as if to protect a living thing. Before Choi's fingers could graze the paper, a hand intercepted his wrist. It wasn't Min-jae's hand. It was Grace Collins'. The movement was so swift and economical that it seemed to defy her age. Grace didn't use a weapon, she didn't need one. She stepped forward, positioning her body between the desk and the enforcer, her presence expanding until she seemed to dwarf the muscular men in the room. She didn't look like a grandmother at a bus stop anymore. She looked like a monolith. "The child is reading," Grace said. Her voice was low, vibrating with a tectonic power that made the glass walls of the office hum. It wasn't an argument. It was a law. Choi snarled, trying to shake his arm free. Grace's grip was like iron. She didn't just hold his wrist. She controlled his center of gravity. "Let go of me, old woman," he hissed, his face inches from hers. "You have no idea where you are." Grace didn't blink. Her deep-lined face remained as calm as a deep well. "I know exactly where I am," she replied softly. "I am in a room full of men who are afraid of a 7-year-old girl's voice, and I am the woman who taught her how to use it." She looked Choi, her eyes locking on to Kang Min-jae. The boss watching the confrontation, his eyes wide, seeing for the first time that the shield and guide behind the child was not a secondary character. She was the foundation. "Mr. Kang," Grace said, her voice cutting through Choi's posturing. "You made an agreement. You gave your word in front of your ancestors and your men. Is your word as hollow as the walls of this office?" The challenge was a physical blow. Min-jae looked at the gold ring on his finger, then at the ledger and finally at Grace. He saw the fire in her eyes. The kind of fire that survives decades of being overlooked, the kind of fire that builds empires from nothing. He realized then that if he allowed his enforcer to touch book, he wasn't just losing his secrets, he was losing his honor. Min-jae said. It was a single word, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. The enforcer froze. He looked at the boss, then back at Grace. He saw the absolute lack of fear in the elderly woman's face, and for a second, he looked truly terrified. He slowly pulled his arm back. Grace released him with a flick of her wrist. a gesture of dismissal that was more insulting than a slap. She didn't move back to the shadows. She stayed right where she was, standing shoulder to shoulder with Amara. Her hand returned to the child's shoulder, but the gesture had changed. It was no longer just a comfort, it was a coronation. She was the guardian of the truth, and as long as she stood there, the document sacred. "Continue, Amara," Grace whispered, her eyes never leaving the room. Amara looked at her grandmother, drawing strength from the steady, warm pressure of her hand. The loudness of the room had been silenced by a greater, quieter strength. The girl looked down at the final script of the document, the section that had no country, the one written in the language of the lost. The enforcers retreated into the semicircle, their folded arms no longer a sign of authority, but a shield against the truth. They realized that they weren't just watching a girl read, they were watching a bloodline reclaim its dignity. The shadowed threat had been met, and it had been defeated not by force, but by the refusal to be intimidated. The office once again a temple of ink and silence. "There is one more bridge," Amara said, her voice clear and unwavering. The tension in the office had shifted from a sharp, electric threat to a heavy, suffocating weight. Kang Min-jae sat perfectly still, staring at the closed ledger as if he were looking at his own tombstone. The enforcer Choi had retreated, his wrist likely bruised by Grace's grip. But the damage to the room's hierarchy was far more permanent. Min-jae's men were no longer looking at him with the blind devotion of soldiers. They were looking at him with the clinical detachment of investors, deciding whether to liquidate an asset. The 3 million check sat on the corner of the desk, a small, white rectangle that seemed to glow under the harsh LED lights. It was the physical manifestation of the agreement that had started as a cruel joke and ended as a confession. Min-jae reached out, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched the gold-nibbed pen. His ego screamed at him to tear the check up, to have the woman and the child escorted out of the building or worse, and to handle his brother's betrayal with the violence that had made him famous. To pay the money was to admit that a 7-year-old girl had outplayed his entire intelligence. It was an admission of vulnerability. "You have the names," Min-jae said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "You have the dates. You have the Incheon terminal. Why should I pay you for a truth that has already cost me everything?" Grace Collins didn't move. She stood as she had throughout the entire ordeal, a pillar of silver and granite. "You aren't paying for the truth, Mr. Kang." Her voice a calm, resonant counterpoint to his desperation. "The truth was free. You are paying for your honor. You made a promise in front of your men, in front of your ancestors, and in front of this child. In your world, when a man's word is gone, what is left of the man?" Min-jae looked up at her. He saw the shield and guide standing over the child, and for a fleeting second, he saw a reflection of the mother he had left Busan decades ago. A woman who believed that the only thing a person truly owned. He looked at Amara, who was watching him with a strange, quiet pity. She didn't look like she wanted his money. She looked like she was waiting for him to be the man he to be. The silence stretched agonizingly thin. One of the high-ranking guards cleared his throat, a subtle but unmistakable signal. The men were waiting to see if their leader was a man of his word, or just a bully with a gold ring. If he reneged now, he wasn't just cheating a child. He was telling his organization that contracts meant nothing. Min-jae's gaze drifted back to the ledger. He thought of the ghost code, the archaic language of his fathers that spoke of debts and the master of the house, eating the crumbs of his own table. He realized that if he broke the agreement, he would be the one eating the crumbs. With a sudden, decisive movement, he pulled the check toward him. He didn't tear it. He didn't slide it away. He picked up the pen and, with a flourish that felt like a surrender, he added his official seal to the document. "A debt of honor," Min-jae muttered, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He slid the check across the mahogany desk. It stopped inches from Amara's hand. "The 3 million is yours. The debt for the house in the valley is cleared. And the Collins name is protected. By my word." He looked at his men, his voicing a sliver of its old iron. "Let it be known. The child read the document. The agreement is satisfied." Amara didn't grab the check. She looked at it, then at Grace. Only when her grandmother gave a slow, Nod did the girl reach out and take the paper. She didn't tuck it away greedily. She held it with the same respect she had shown the ancient ledger. "Thank you, Mr. Kang," Amara said. Her voice was small, but it carried a weight of dignity that seemed to humble the room. The ink was true. Min Jae didn't smile, he couldn't. He felt as though he had just paid a king's ransom to be told his house was on fire. But as he watched Grace and Amara prepare to leave, he felt a strange, flickering sense of relief. He had lost his money, his brother's loyalty, and his pride, but he had kept everything the ghost code insisted upon. He had kept his soul. Min Jae said, turning his chair toward the window, looking out at the city he no longer fully controlled. "Before I remember who I am supposed to be." Grace placed her hand on Amara's shoulder, guiding her toward the heavy double doors. They walked through the semicircle of enforcers, who parted like a dark sea. No one spoke, no one mocked. The agreement was a bridge they had crossed, leaving the billionaire behind in the smoke of his own revelations. The heavy double doors of the inner sanctum swung open, with a muffled thud, echoing like the closing of a tomb for the world Kang Min-jae had built. Amara clutched the denim of her jacket, her small fingers steady, while Grace's hand remained a warm, unwavering presence on her shoulder. As they stepped out of the office and into the long, marble-floored corridor that led to the elevators, the atmosphere changed instantly. The corridor was lined with men, the enforcers, the lookouts, the mid-level lieutenants who had the last hour whispering about the little girl the boss was using for a joke. They had heard the shouting. They had heard the sudden, terrifying silences. And through the glass partitions of the outer offices, they had seen the silhouette of their untouchable leader slumped in his chair, stripped of his boisterous laughter. As Grace and Amara moved forward, the walk became a procession. The first pair of guards, men with scars and cold eyes who had smirked when the child entered, didn't move to block their path. Instead, as Amara approached, they took a synchronized step back. It wasn't just a clearance of the way, it was a retreat. Then, one by one, their heads lowered. It started at the beginning of the hall and rippled toward the end. A slow, somber wave of bowing. They weren't bowing to the $3 million. In this building, 3 million was merely a number on a ledger. They were bowing to the child who had looked at the ghost code and didn't blink. They were bowing to the woman who had held the wrist of their most violent brother and didn't tremble. The power dynamic had been completely inverted. The invisible people, the elderly woman and the young girl who usually occupied the periphery of the city's vision, were now the only ones in the building who seemed to possess any weight. The marble reflected their shadows, long and sharp, while the men's suits seemed to blur into the background, becoming the scenery in a story that no longer belonged to them. Amara looked neither left nor right. Gaze was fixed on the silver doors of the elevator at the end of the hall. She felt the eyes of the underworld on her, but they no longer felt like weight, they felt like wind. She remembered of the room they had just left and realized that the greatest power wasn't in the shouting, but in the truth that forced others to be quiet. Grace walked with a measured, rhythmic pace, her dark blazer buttoned tight, her pattern a splash of vibe life against the sterile, gray corporate hallway. She didn't gloat. She didn't cast triumphant glances at the men who bowed as they passed. She carried herself with the quiet, terrifying dignity of a queen returning from a border she had successfully defended. She was the shield, yes, but she was also the guide, leading Amara out of the darkness and back into the light of the world they knew. When they reached the elevator, the man stationed there, the one who had checked their bags, with such condescension earlier pressed the button for them. He didn't meet their eyes. He kept his head bowed until the doors slid open. They stepped inside the silver box, the mirrored walls reflecting their image, a grandmother and her granddaughter, small but indestructible. As the doors began to close, Amara caught one last glimpse of the corridor. The men were still standing there, still silent, still bowing to the space where the girl had been. The elevator began its long, smooth descent. For the first time since they had entered the building, the pressure in Amara's chest began to lift. The silence here was different. It wasn't the fear or the silence of a secret. It was the silence of a job well done. "Did we win, Grandma?" Amara whispered, her voice sounding very young again in the quiet of the elevator. Grace looked down at her, a soft, rare smile touching the corners of her mouth. She reached out and smoothed a stray hair on Amara's high puff. Winning is for games, Amara. Today, you did something much harder. You made them see you. The elevator chimed as they reached the lobby. The doors opened into the bustling, indifferent world of the city, where no one knew about the ghost code or the $3 million check hidden in a denim jacket. But as they stepped out onto the sidewalk, Amara walked a little taller, her stiff posture reply a fluid, easy grace. She wasn't just a girl who had read a document, she was a girl who had changed the gravity of a room. The corridor of bowing men was far behind them, but the power they had reclaimed would stay with them long after the ink on the check had dried. The sun was beginning to dip below the skyline as Amara and Grace reached the street, casting long, golden shadows that stretched across the pavement like the bridges Amara had described in the ledger. The city was loud, chaotic symphony of horns and rushing footsteps, but to Amara, the noise no longer felt a weight pressing against her chest. The loudness of the world had lost its sharp edges. As they walked toward the bus stop, Amara looked down at her denim jacket. Only an hour ago, she had felt small inside it, as if the fabric were a shell she was hiding in to avoid being seen. Now the jacket felt like armor. She reached into her pocket and felt the crisp edge of the check, but her mind wasn't on the money or the house in the valley. She was thinking about the look in Kang Min-jae's eyes when she had finished reading the ghost code. It wasn't the look a grown man gives a child. It was the look a captain's the sea full of wary, breath respect for a force he could not control. "Grandma," Amara said softly, her voice steady against the roar of a passing delivery truck. He was afraid, wasn't he? Grace didn't answer immediately. She stopped at the edge of the curb, the silver gray of her hair catching the light like a halo. She looked down at her granddaughter, her wise, lined face softening with a pride that went deeper than victory. "He wasn't afraid of you, Amara," Grace said, her voice a calm anchor in the evening rush. "He was afraid of the light you carried into his dark room. Men like that build their lives on the idea that they can hide the truth. When you read those words, you showed him that there is no such thing as a secret, only things that haven't been heard yet." Amara nodded, a new understanding taking root in her mind. She realized that she was no longer just a girl with a neat high puff and a gift for languages. She was a voice. Where the most dangerous men traded in silos, she had become the one thing they couldn't buy and the one thing they couldn't ignore. She thought of the men who had bowed in the corridor. They hadn't bowed because they were told to. They had bowed because, for a brief moment, she had been the most powerful person in their world. The bus arrived, its brakes sing as it pulled to the curb. They climbed the steps and found a seat near the back, the plastic upholstery cool against Amara's legs. As the bus pulled away, she looked out the window at the towering skyscraper they had just left. It looked different now, less like a fortress and more like a fragile cage. Amara leaned her head against the window, watching her reflection in the glass. She saw a 7-year-old girl, yes, but she also saw the girl who had seen a Mafia boss with a single sentence. She realized that from this day forward, her name would be whispered in rooms she would never enter. The invisible girl was gone. In her place, a person who understood that dignity wasn't something granted by billionaires or enforcers, but something revealed through the courage to speak when it mattered most. The city continued to breathe around them, uneven and unfinished, but inside the quiet of the bus, something had changed forever. Amara closed her eyes, the bus matching the steady cadence of her own heart. She wasn't scared of the next